In 1947, a Baptist pastor named David Morrison found something that would change his life forever and almost kill him. Hidden in a library of an abandoned monastery in Syria, he discovered scrolls containing the true reason why God ordered the total destruction of the Canaanites. What he read that night made him cry for 3 consecutive days, and when he tried to share this truth with his congregation, he was expelled from the church on the same day. Today, for the first time, you will discover what David Morrison saw in those scrolls. But I warn you, after you know this truth, your faith will never be the same. Have you ever wondered why God, being infinitely merciful, ordered what appears to be the most brutal genocide in human history? Deuteronomy 20:16-17 leaves no doubt. But of the cities of these people, which the Lord thy God doth give thee for an inheritance, thou shalt save alive nothing that breatheth, but thou shalt utterly destroy them, namely the Hittites and the Amorites, the Canaanites and the Perizzites. For centuries, pastors and theologians have given superficial explanations. It was because of idolatry, they say. It was to preserve the purity of the chosen people, they claim. But these answers never explained the desperate urgency in God's words. Why not convert? Why not expel? Why was the specific order to destroy everything that breathed? The truth is that there exists a spiritual dimension to this story that was deliberately hidden from modern congregations. And this truth is recorded not only in the Bible, but in ancient texts that the primitive church knew very well, until they decided to bury them forever. Pastor David Morrison, whom I mentioned at the beginning, wasn't looking for answers when he entered that ruined monastery. He was just fleeing from a sandstorm during a missionary trip. But when he lit a lantern in that dust-covered library, his eyes encountered something that shouldn't exist: Aramaic copies of the Book of Enoch and fragments of the Book of Jubilees. These were texts that the Catholic Church had banned in the 4th century. Imagine his sensation at that moment, his hands trembling while holding scrolls that were over 1,000 years old, knowing he was seeing something that very few people in modern history had access to. The smell of ancient parchment mixed with incense that still permeated that sacred place. The absolute silence of the Syrian desert, broken only by the sound of pages being turned with extreme care. David was a simple man, educated in a traditional seminary. He was accustomed to conventional biblical interpretations, but what he was about to discover would completely shatter his comfortable theology and force him to confront a spiritual reality he never imagined existed. What David read that cold desert night completely changed his understanding about the Canaanites. Because, according to these ancient texts that were contemporary to biblical writings, the Canaanites weren't just common idolaters. They were something much more sinister. The Book of Enoch, chapter 15, reveals something terrifying. And now the giants who were born of spirit and flesh will be called evil spirits upon the earth, and on earth shall be their dwelling. Evil spirits proceed from their bodies, and these evil spirits afflict, oppress, destroy, attack, make war, and cause destruction on the earth. Do you understand what this means? The Canaanites weren't normal descendants of Noah. They were descendants of the Nephilim, the giants mentioned in Genesis 6. These were born from the union between the sons of God and the daughters of men. When the flood came, these giants died, but their spirits remained on earth as demons. And here's the part that will make your skin crawl. According to the Book of Jubilees, some of these Nephilim survived the flood. Og, king of Bashan, mentioned in the Bible, had an iron bed over 4 meters long. Goliath of Gath measured almost 3 meters tall. These weren't normal humans. They were demonic hybrids carrying corrupted DNA. David Morrison spent the entire night translating these texts with trembling hands. He discovered that the Canaanites practiced something that went far beyond common idolatry. They offered their living children to demons through rituals involving complete demonic possession. The children weren't just sacrificed. They were possessed by evil spirits before dying, creating an entire generation of spiritual hybrids. Imagine the horror he felt reading these descriptions. Parents voluntarily delivering their own children to be inhabited by demons. Children of 5, 6 years old being used as hosts for entities that had one objective: to corrupt and destroy everything God had created. And this didn't happen occasionally. It was a systematic practice, an entire culture built around worship and servitude to demonic forces. The most disturbing scroll that David found that night contained a translation that had never been included in official Bible versions. And YHWH said to Moses, "You shall have no mercy on them, because the blood running in their veins is not human blood, but blood corrupted by the fallen. If you allow even one to survive, the corruption will spread like plague until nothing remains of God's image on earth." David stopped reading for a few minutes at this point. His hands were sweating, his heart was beating uncontrollably. He was beginning to understand that everything he had preached about God's cruelty in the Old Testament was completely wrong. God wasn't being cruel. He was being surgical. Now you understand why God couldn't simply convert or expel the Canaanites. You don't negotiate with demons. You don't convert spiritual hybrids. The contamination was so deep that even contact with them could corrupt the spiritual DNA of God's people. When the Bible says in Numbers 13:33, "There we saw giants, the descendants of Anak, who come from the giants, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight," it wasn't exaggerating. These were literally descendants of the Nephilim who survived the flood. And God's order to destroy even the animals, because the demonic rituals of the Canaanites corrupted everything around them. Animals were used in sacrifices that opened dimensional portals. The land was literally cursed. That's why God said it would vomit its inhabitants. David Morrison discovered something even more disturbing. The Canaanites had knowledge of supernatural technologies inherited from fallen angels. They knew how to manipulate physical reality through specific rituals. That's why their cities were so fortified, so difficult to conquer. It wasn't just military strategy, it was ancestral black magic. In one of the best preserved fragments, David found detailed descriptions of how the Canaanites built their fortresses. They didn't use just stones and mortar. They mixed human blood and demonic invocations into the construction itself. Each stone was consecrated to malign entities, creating structures that were literally inhabited by spirits. That's why when Joshua and the Israelites attacked these cities, they faced not just human soldiers, but supernatural forces. The pastor spent 3 days reading these scrolls, and with each page, his worldview crumbled. He had always preached about a God of love, but now he understood that there exists a side of spiritual warfare that the modern church simply doesn't teach. God didn't order a genocide. God ordered a mass exorcism to save humanity from irreversible demonic contamination. On the third night, David found the final piece of the puzzle, a fragment that explained why it was so crucial to completely eliminate the Canaanites. They were carriers of a lineage that would prevent the coming of the Messiah. If they had managed to contaminate the tribes of Israel through mixed marriages or spiritual influence, there would be no pure lineage through which Jesus could be born. "The children of the serpent seek to corrupt the woman's seed," the text said, "for they know that from her will come the one who will crush the dragon's head. Therefore, every drop of corrupted blood that remains on earth is a threat to the Eternal's promise." David understood at that moment that the destruction of the Canaanites wasn't about territory or military conquest. It was about preserving the salvation plan for all humanity. If God had been merciful with the Canaanites, the way modern critics would like, Jesus Christ would never have been born. The Messiah would never have come, and the entire human race would be condemned to eternal slavery under the dominion of the Nephilim's children. When David Morrison returned to his church in Kentucky, he was transformed. His eyes had an intensity his congregants had never seen before. For 3 consecutive Sundays, he preached about his discoveries with a passion that set the entire sanctuary on fire. "Brothers and sisters," he would say with his voice trembling with emotion, "you need to understand that the war against the Canaanites wasn't a divine atrocity. It was a spiritual cleansing operation necessary to preserve the messianic lineage through which Jesus would come to the world. If the Canaanites had completely contaminated the region, there would be no pure lineage through which the Messiah could be born. God wasn't being cruel, he was being surgical." He explained how the satanic rituals of the Canaanites were so powerful they corrupted not just people, but the very land. How child sacrifices created such a toxic spiritual atmosphere that no work of God could prosper there. How each Canaanite family was literally a cell of demonic worship, working to prevent the birth of the Savior. But as the weeks passed, David noticed changes in the congregation, whispers in the corridors, looks of distrust, private church council meetings from which he didn't participate. The truth he had discovered was making people uncomfortable who preferred a more comfortable version of God. The reaction was devastating. Congregation members accused him of heresy. The church council said he was preaching demonic doctrines. People who had been his friends for decades began crossing the street to avoid greeting him. His own wife began questioning if he hadn't been influenced by evil spirits. Less than a week after his 3rd sermon about the Canaanites, David was summoned to an extraordinary council meeting. 23 people whom he had baptized, whose children he had married, whom he had consoled in moments of grief, were sitting around a table looking at him as if he were a dangerous stranger. "Pastor Morrison," said the council president with a coldness that cut like ice, "your recent preaching has caused division in our congregation. Several families have threatened to leave the church. Other pastors in the region are questioning our orthodoxy. We need you to immediately stop preaching these theories." David felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. "Theories," he responded with his voice almost whispering. "I discovered texts that perfectly explain why God acted as he did. You don't understand. This didn't shake my faith, it strengthened it. Now I know that God isn't just passive love, but is a warrior who fights for his children." But the more he spoke, the more he saw fear in their eyes. Fear of truth, fear of a spiritual reality that demanded courage, that required them to confront the fact that there are real forces of darkness operating in the world, and that serving God sometimes means being willing to fight battles that seem impossible. In less than a week, David Morrison was expelled from the denomination he had served for 20 years. 20 years of faithful ministry, thousands of lives touched, hundreds of people brought to Christ. All of this was erased because of 3 sermons about the truth he discovered in 1,000-year-old scrolls. Why? Because the truth about the Canaanites exposes a spiritual reality that the modern church doesn't want to face. That there exists a literal war happening between God's kingdom and the forces of darkness, and that this war sometimes requires actions that seem extreme to minds conditioned to see God only as love and light. The church preferred to teach diluted versions of truth because it's more comfortable to believe that God would never do something that seems violent. But these same people have no problem accepting that God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, that he sent the flood, that he killed all the firstborn of Egypt. The difference is that with the Canaanites, we're talking about contamination that went beyond the physical. It was spiritual, genetic, and dimensional. It was an infection that could have corrupted all of God's creation if it wasn't contained immediately. David realized something that most modern Christians refuse to accept, that there is a cost to serving the true God. That sometimes truth is uncomfortable, frightening, and requires that we abandon infantilized versions of faith in favor of a mature understanding of spiritual reality. Here's something that will make you think twice about the world around us. David Morrison discovered in these ancient texts that the spirits of the Nephilim were never completely eliminated. They were just dispersed, waiting for an opportunity to return. Jesus himself confirmed this when he said in Matthew 12:43-45, "When an impure spirit comes out of a person, it goes through arid places seeking rest and does not find it. Then it says, 'I will return to the house I left.' When it arrives, it finds the house unoccupied, swept clean and put in order. Then it goes and takes with it 7 other spirits more wicked than itself, and they go in and live there." The rituals that the Canaanites practiced, they never stopped. They just changed form. The secret societies that control the world today use the same symbols, the same rituals, the same invocations that the Canaanites used 3,000 years ago. Why do you think Hollywood is obsessed with movies about demons and possession? Why are occult symbols everywhere in the media? Why is there a systematic attack on Christian values in all spheres of society? Because the same spiritual force that inhabited the Canaanites is trying to establish its dominion over earth again. And this time, they don't need physical territories. They have something much more powerful: control of the collective mind through technology and media. David Morrison spent the last 20 years of his life documenting these connections. He discovered that the same child sacrifice rituals that the Canaanites practiced are being performed today by globalist elites. The same symbols that adorned Molech's temples appear in multinational corporation logos. The same demonic possession techniques that corrupted Canaanite children are being used through mass mental programming via entertainment and social networks. He realized that the battle Joshua fought 3,000 years ago never ended. It just changed venues. And now, instead of facing some thousands of Canaanites in a small region of the Middle East, we're facing billions of people influenced by the same malign spirits on a global scale. David Morrison spent his final years as an independent pastor, preaching the truth he discovered in that monastery to small groups who had the courage to listen. He created a secret network of pastors and scholars who preserved and disseminated these ancient texts, knowing that one day humanity would need this information to understand what was happening in the world. He died in 2019 at age 78, but before departing, he hid copies of these scrolls in different places around the world. Private libraries, isolated monasteries, safes of trusted people. He knew that a time would come when this truth would need to come to light again. I had access to one of these copies through a pastor in Syria who knew Morrison personally. And when I read those texts, I understood why the official church never wanted you to know this truth. It's not because it shakes faith, it's because it strengthens it in a way that makes people dissatisfied with superficial and politically correct Christianity. When you understand that God destroyed the Canaanites to save all humanity, you stop apologizing for divine justice and start celebrating it. When you realize that there's a real spiritual war happening, you stop playing church and start equipping yourself for battle. When you comprehend that Jesus Christ came to the world because God eliminated a demonic contamination that would have prevented his birth, your gratitude becomes deeper than you ever imagined. The truth that your church has hidden from you for 3,000 years is this: God didn't order a genocide against the Canaanites. He ordered a rescue operation to save humanity from demonic contamination that could have prevented the coming of Jesus Christ. And today, more than ever, we need to understand this truth, because the same spiritual battle continues, just on a global scale. The same spirits that inhabited the Canaanites are operating through world systems to establish their dominion again. But now you know the truth. You know that you serve a God who doesn't just love, but who fights for you. A God who will do anything necessary to protect his children and preserve his salvation plan. You have a choice now. You can continue believing the diluted versions of truth that you were taught, or you can accept that we serve a God who is both perfectly loving and perfectly just. A God who shed innocent blood so you could live, but who also shed guilty blood so you could be born. If this video touched something deep in your heart, it's because God wanted this truth to reach you today. Subscribe to the channel and activate notifications, because in the next videos, I'll reveal more secrets that the official church doesn't want you to discover. I'll show how Canaanite symbols are still being used today, how to recognize the influence of Nephilim spirits in modern society, and how to spiritually protect yourself against the same forces that Joshua faced 3,000 years ago. And answer me in the comments. After knowing the truth about the Canaanites, how has this changed your vision of God's justice? Do you have the courage to defend a God who fights for you, even when his actions seem incomprehensible to limited human minds? Share this video only with people you know are ready for the truth, because some revelations can change a life or destroy a weak faith. May God bless you with courage to always seek truth, even when it's uncomfortable. See you in the next video.